Kia ora, and welcome to New Zealand Elections in History. I'm Worley, and in this series, I'll cover every New Zealand general election, from 1853 up until 2020. I've planned to do this series for a while, and it's inspired by Mr. Beat's series on US elections, as well as other similar videos. I'll add the links to those channels in the description below. In this episode, I'll cover a brief history of New Zealand up until our first ever election. Then I'll get into the election itself. New Zealand is a group of small islands at the bottom of the South Pacific, next to Australia. Explorers first settled in New Zealand from Polynesia over 1,000 years ago. The largest of these were the Māori, now New Zealand's indigenous people. In 1642, Dutch explorer Abel Tasman was the first European to set eyes on these islands and called them New Zealand, after the islands and coastline reminded him of the island of Zeeland in Denmark. Tasman would never set foot on New Zealand soil, but British naval officer and explorer Captain James Cook would. Arriving in 1769, he would initially run into trouble, his crew getting involved in skirmishes with local Māori over misunderstandings. However, he would make progress, successfully mapping out the islands, claiming New Zealand for Britain, and establish a cordial relationship with Māori, who relished the opportunity to trade their produce for European goods and weapons. In 1840, Great Britain sought to establish their dominance over New Zealand and officially claim her as part of their empire. The British Crown and Māori would sign the controversial Treaty of Waitangi, considered New Zealand's founding document, which made New Zealand a colony of Great Britain. This treaty made New Zealand a colony that would be administrated by a colonial governor and Her Majesty Queen Victoria's government in Britain. The treaty also stated that in the eyes of the Crown, Māori were equal to and had the same rights as European settlers, and their status, especially that of tribal chiefs, would be acknowledged and respected. However, many Māori chiefs who signed believed they would only cede their governance to the Crown, not their sovereignty, believing that the British would only rule over European settlers and Māori would be free to govern themselves with their own laws and way of life. As early as 1845, some Māori had become so discontent they rebelled against colonial rule, leading to a year-long war in the northern region of New Zealand, fought between anti-British Māori on one side and British forces, supported by pro-British Māori. By the 1850s, however, things had calmed down, and New Zealand was able to take its first steps as a colonial nation. 1853 was a big year in New Zealand constitutional history, with the establishment of both provincial and colonial governments. The New Zealand Constitution Act 1852, passed by the Parliament of the United Kingdom, established a bicameral New Zealand Parliament, with the lower house, the House of Representatives, being elected by a popular vote. Votes were to be cast under a simple first-past-the-post system. To qualify as a voter, one needed to be male, to be a British subject, to be at least 21 years old, and to own a certain value of land. The first ever election for the colonial parliament was held from July 14th to October 1st, 1853, to elect 37 members of the House of Representatives. Due to the difficulties of travel and the small number of electoral offices, early elections were staggered over weeks or months. After the election, Parliament wouldn't meet until May 1854, almost 1 year after the election was held. In these early colonial days, there were no political parties, only independents, which made forming a government difficult with a wide range of views amongst the elected members of Parliament. MP for the town of Christchurch electorate, Henry Sewell, was appointed as New Zealand's first Premier by Governor Thomas Gore Browne. Now, for the sake of time and so I don't bore you, the next 35 years of parliamentary democracy in colonial New Zealand from 1855 to 1890 won't be covered in great detail. This period can both be described as chaotic and dull. Chaotic because governments would form and collapse in rapid succession, causing New Zealand to have no less than 24 premiers during this time span. And dull because not much happened or changed during this period of colonial history. So come back for the election of 1890.